It's episode 575 of the Locked On Texas Rangers podcast. On today's show, I'm recording with a special guest, Pat Ellington Jr., talking about the history and the present of black baseball in America. First, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. It's going to be some really great stuff with him. I am so excited for y'all to listen to this episode. I meant to get this to you guys last week, probably during Jackie Robinson Day. Or Monday. We had a little bit of a recording, scheduling issue on my part, but it is a really great conversation, well worth your time. I'll get more into the Mariners series and all that's going on in Texas Rangers baseball this week, but I felt like after an off day, this would be a great time for this conversation with Pat. Here you are, this episode of Locked On Rangers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On to the Texas Rangers. I'm your host, Bryce Patrick, here today joined by Pat Ellington Jr., guy who writes for Baseball Prospectus, an expert on all things baseball. I want to thank you guys so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen every single day. If you're not already, go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Bryce Patrick, follow the show at Locked On Rangers, and follow Pat at tangible_Uno, and subscribe on YouTube. We are inching closer to 800 subscribers. Pat, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So thank you for coming on, because it kind of caught me by surprise. I meant to have you on sometime last week for Jackie Robinson Day, because you are writing a book about Jackie Robinson. Can you tell the listeners what is that book about? I mean, besides obviously Jackie Robinson, the great baseball player he was, the great activist that he was, what are some of the things that you're proud of that you have written in that book, and where can the people find it?
So it's a book being published by SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research, about Jackie Robinson's portrayal in different types of media, whether it be types of books, movies, songs, documentaries, etc., articles, and whatnot. It's called Not an Easy Tale to Tell, Jackie on the Page, Stage, and Screen. It's a compilation of different essays by different authors. The main editor was Ralph Carhart. He recruited me. It's right here. You can find it on paperback, and it's also has a digital copy. I have an essay in the book on Ken Burns' documentary about Jackie Robinson. So that was my focus, and I'm proud of the work that I did.
Well, that's great. I haven't seen Ken Burns' documentary on Jackie. What were some of the things that you noticed about him and about the way that he's perceived?
So, one thing that really stuck out to me was the amount of myths that it took for white America to tolerate Jackie Robinson, and just how great he was, in a sense, and just how much distortion of who he was it took for them to accept him, and what he was trying to do for the African diaspora, because he served the entire African diaspora, not just Black Americans. That's explicitly been researched and covered, and it's actually covered in documentary, and I went over that in the essay that I wrote. It's a 1,400-word essay. I also feel like another thing about Jackie, that his story gets, and his countenance and who he was, his character, it gets personally, his personality, it gets pacified a lot by people in the media, people who write about him, people in baseball cover him, things like that, even to the point where it's blatant lies and myths that have become accepted as fact about Jackie and who he was.
What are some of those things that the media gets wrong about who he was, and that the perception is inaccurate? Because I know his story gets told a lot, but it's kind of usually at like a 1,000-foot view, like, oh, look, Jackie Robinson, he broke the barrier, and yay, that's it. Because I feel like there's not a whole lot, or not nearly enough talked about him.
They frequently talk about him turning the other cheek, and they'll gloss over the fact that he was allowed to retaliate, but they won't go as far as how far he went to retaliate, and the fact that what he was doing was with the platform that he had as a Major League Baseball player at that time, and as one of the first, as the very first black player, with the attention and scope he had and the microscope he had on him, him acting out the way he did was huge on the record and off the record, and that's who he was on the field and off the field, because throughout his life he had interactions with white people in public that um he wasn't going to allow them to treat him like a bottom class citizen that American social norms wanted individuals African descent to be. And not just American social norms, that was mostly, I mean, that's any part of the West at that time. So naturally. So whether it be when he was in the army, him getting his altercation with two police officers that were discriminating against him at a train station or something like that, and while he was in uniform and things like that, and also black veterans at the time were targeted because they were in uniform during and after World War II, and you know, and even during the documentary, there's a point where he was on a he was in an American town, and there was German prisoners of war that were allowed in restaurants that he couldn't be in, and he couldn't get served in.
That's just nuts. That's just absolutely insane, and something that a lot of people who look like me
Like,
don't
I mean,
understand.
and I mean, it's not even that people don't understand. It doesn't get talked about. It gets swept under the rug purposely. I mean, it gets nullified for for the reasons. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, things like that should not be forgotten.
No, absolutely not. And I think I really like that thing that you talked about is that people always use the example of turn the other cheek. And something interesting that I heard about that turn of phrase in church is, you know, there are basically two type of ways that you could hit somebody back when Jesus was talking about that parable. Either you could like punch them in the face, or you could hit them with an open slap. And if they slapped you across the face, they usually did that. You can only hit someone with your right hand. So if they slapped you across the face, then that was them saying like, you know, a message that, oh, I'm better than you. You're not even good enough for me to punch you in the face. But if you turn the other cheek, you have to punch me in the face, and that signifies that you think that I'm an equal. So it wasn't about just taking it. It's about, you know, being creative and, you know, standing up for yourself without necessarily, you
It's
know,
about personal sovereignty and also serving example. Because I will say this from our perspective, I don't think people um really understand how embarrassing it is to go through racism in public from somebody, not just because of the happening in itself, but also the idea that this individual sees you and they think they have carte blanche to violate you on that level, and that it's okay, and that they think that you're not going to do anything about it.
yeah, it
It,
is.
it's to be tried like that is just insane. And yeah, and that's one thing for me too with the documentary. It didn't really let up on reminding people about the racism that black people were going through at the time, and to use black voices to do that, whether it be the heavily featuring of Jackie's wife, Rachel Robinson, um, whether it be historians, mostly black sports historians, black politicians, black cultural leaders, and things like that, um, teammates and other things like that. And there were it heavily featured the black perspective, because you really can't tell Jackie's story without us, because I mean, just with the impact that he had on our community and what he did, and two things that Ken Burns keyed on was Jackie's influence on the careers of and the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr. and Haas Malik Shabazz, formerly known as Malcolm X. And he did deep dive. He did a deep dive into that, into relationships, and how when Malcolm X was in Malcolm, well, formerly known as Malcolm Little, when he was in jail then, and during Jackie's debut, and his debut inspired him to transform and change who he was when he was in prison, and then led him down the path to activism. And when Malcolm got out of prison, Jackie, they built a relationship, and so and also Jackie was a similar shit with Dr. King. Because Dr. King was similarly inspired too, because Dr. King was also around the same age too. So when this happened, so he was also a young man when Jackie debuted. So and he understood the intersection of black baseball with the inherent revolutionism, going back to Negro leagues and things like that. Because Negro leagues were revolutionary itself when you have black baseball players from all over the world playing for black owned teams and black owned league, and there's black woman owners and things like that. And I don't in history of capitalism, there's never been a sports league like that, or a network that's been created like that that also helped Major League Baseball survive too. So there's a lot of intersections in the documentary that I wrote about and that I kind of silly highlighted with the focus on Jackie. Whether it be the mini Mignoso link too, because there was deep dive into that, and also the documentary also briefly touched on Martin Luther King's relationship with Roberto Clemente, Afro Latino player whose revolutionary attitude and acts get swept under the rug, similar to Jackie's, even in the worst way.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I want to get into Roberto Clemente and a little bit more about the Negro Leagues that people don't know about. But first, I want to tell you guys to take a word to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, news, and including this year's basketball players in the start of the Major League Baseball season. If you want to bet on the Dallas Mavericks, who just had an incredible win over the Jazz, shout out to the Locked On Mavericks crew, and also shout out to David Locke of the Locked On Jazz crew. If you want to go make some bets on the Mavs or the Stars or the Rangers for some reason, then you can go to betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. And now, back to my talk with Pat Ellington Jr. And we are back with Pat Ellington Jr. of Baseball Prospectus of other places, great baseball writer, talking all things about black baseball, Jackie Robinson, and the Negro Leagues. Thank you guys so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen every single day. Pat, I want to talk about the Negro Leagues because they were such an integral part of black baseball and sports culture in general, and I feel like they don't get nearly enough recognition. They finally, on Baseball Reference, started adding those leagues back in to tell the history of those teams, but I don't think people understand how revolutionary it was and how different it was, because you talked about it being a black-run business, a black-owned league, and how unique that was in the sports landscape, like not only in North America, but in most of professional major sports.
Even and mind you, this was 100 years ago, literally. So
yeah,
which makes it even crazier on exponentially. When the unique thing about the Negro Leagues was that it featured black baseball players from all over the African diaspora, whether it be Black American players, African Caribbean players, Afro Latino players that played in the league, and from the Bahamas, Curacao, Cuba, Dominican Republic, anywhere Latin America and the Caribbean. So mostly. So the history is there. And mind you, black baseball players from Black America also went to the winter leagues in those countries to play too, because they were allowed in those spaces, and there was space created there by the black players in those countries for everyone to play too. So it was on a global scale. It's not just the Negro Leagues. But one thing about the Negro Leagues that people don't realize was that the Negro Leagues were drawing in more black fans, were drawing in majority black crowds, and they were out drawing major league teams.
That's
like it's
crazy.
on the record. Like the Pittsburgh, like I can't remember which Pittsburgh team it was. Either the Crawfords or the Homesteads, but they ran on the MLB stadium and they outdrew the MLB team for that year at that stadium.
That's amazing.
By like 400,000 people or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
It's crazy. I mean, I don't think people realize how strong the brand of black baseball was, and how global it was either. And how it's been systematically dismantled since black baseball players were allowed to integrate into Major League Baseball.
Yeah, and I think the frustrating thing about, as amazing and necessary and great as it was for Jackie to break the color barrier, like the Negro Leagues basically breaking up. I mean, what happened to the Negro
They're
Leagues after?
disintegrated. In a sense, major league teams use their leverage to buy all the players up.
So they were just all gone. I mean, how quickly did this happen? Because I know Jackie broke the color barrier in
In '47, by
1940,
the late '60s, all the legit leagues were defunct.
which it sucks that there even had to be a Negro League, but it shows the ingenuity of black people and like to form their own league and be like, you know what, you're not going to let us play in your league, then screw you. We're going to build a better baseball league with better baseball players, and we're going to
And
outdraw
mind
you.
you, it's historically documented how much Major League Baseball teams, coaches, players, etc., violated the gentleman's agreement that forbade black players from playing in the league to learn from them.
Really, what was going on with that? Because I don't think I've heard much of anything
Um,
about that agreement.
so you didn't know? So the gentleman's agreement was created by Cap Anson, Hall of Famer, one of Major League Baseball's first superstars, to segregate the league and to keep black baseball players out of the league. That was in the late 1800s, I think.
Huh. Interesting. So they weren't allowed to like talk with black players, or, like learn from them, or
I mean, they weren't supposed to. You weren't supposed to like have black players associated with your organization in any way. Black people associated with your organization in any way.
that's
Those
I've
were those were
literally
the
never
rules.
heard of that. Which shocking. A lot of things that get swept under the rug. But one of the guys who's also very very influential, and I know a couple of Puerto Rican players actually. Carlos Correa. One of the things that makes me really like this kid. One of the Rangers minor league writers who was there was talking to Carlos, and he was asking. It was back when he was in Double A, before he had made the major leagues. I don't know, 6-7 years ago, a long time. But he was asking Carlos, like, hey, what are some of your like career goals and things like that? And he talked about he wanted to help get Roberto Clemente's number retired because he was extremely influential for Latin American players and black Latin American players. And I just want to talk about how influential he was, and not only what an amazing Hall of Fame player he was, but the fact that he did so much for black Latin American players, because it's not just you talked about it earlier. Jackie wasn't just for black players, but all the African diaspora.
Yeah, so I would say so. Roberto Clemente, he was just as much about serving all black people as Jackie Robinson was. There was a story about him fighting against Jim Crow segregation in the South when he was in the minor leagues and in spring training for all black players for them to eat at the restaurants, to be able to get served at hotels and things like that. When he was in the minors, he's been on record saying that he's equally black as he is Afro Latino, as he is Latino, and that there's two checks against him because in America because he's black and Latino. He's um, he was a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They were very close confidants. He frequently hosted the, the Morehouse graduate at his ranch in Puerto Rico, and they had a very close relationship, similarly to what because they had the same ideas. You could clearly see it's evident that Roberto Clemente was following in Jackie's example, and that they were cut from the same type of cloth, and after that they were the same type of person, but just from different parts of the African diaspora. And,
Yeah,
and,
that is.
and that's what made them different.
Yeah, that is. He is really influential and was an all star
And
all the
and
way.
and um and Roberto Clemente was very influential too because he didn't let people anglicize his name. Whether it be calling him Bobby or Robert or things like that. Baseball cards are on record. Him doing interviews in Spanish, especially after winning the World Series in 1970, was huge. I don't think people realize how revolutionary that was. Just for him to be able to do that interview in Spanish and to translate and to be able to have that and to be himself. But Roberto Clemente, his a lot of his continence and who he was gets swept under the rug. His adamancy about being acknowledged as a black man from Latin America, as Latin America actually has more individuals of African descent than North America does,
Mhm.
and that's on record. So there's that aspect that really gets nullified with him, similar to Jackie, and and there's very similar in terms of their greatness on the field and who they were off the field and how they brought that on the field with them, and they weren't going to take no for an answer. And for me, following that example and having that legacy to follow up in my writing and how I observe them, it's important that I tell who they were because that's just me upholding their legacy, truly to the
Mhm.
point that they will want,
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
based on their actions.
And their legacy is really important, and the legacy they left for black players in the current game. And we're getting into a little bit of the history of a little bit more about the history of black players in baseball and why they aren't nearly as prominent, and black culture isn't nearly as prominent in baseball as it was in the early days. This episode is also brought to you by RockAuto.com. With the ever-increasing number of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Hard to do, often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning, and wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. You have computers with access to RockAuto.com at home and in your pocket. You can save time and money using Rock Auto. Why do you spend up to 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every single customer. They got everything that you can need. So go explore their easy-to-use website today. Find the solution to your auto part needs. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, locked on in their How'd You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. And now back to my talk with Pat Ellington Jr. We are joined with Pat Ellington Jr. talking about Jackie Robinson and black baseball and Roberto Clemente and all kinds of great stuff. If you're not already, go ahead and follow Pat on Twitter at tangible_uno. And one of the things you talked about is not letting people anglicize his name of Roberto Clemente. And I think that's something that I've heard a little bit about, but I'm not as familiar with Henry Aaron. I've heard different people call it because he's generally known as Hank, and I've heard a few baseball writers start referring to him as Henry because that is how he wanted to be referred, and Hank I don't know the history. Do you know a little bit about the history behind that?
So his name is Henry. Hank is like a nickname or like a short name for Henry, and um it can it can kind of be received as kind of like boyish in a sense, and acknowledging his manhood in a sense, or who he is, and it's kind of similar to just claiming who you are, your name is your name, you know. So you don't want you just it's a principle. You just don't want anybody to violate your name. Like you would want somebody to respect calling your name properly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Knowingly, like I mean, that's intentionally ignoring someone's wishes to be called by their name is really disrespectful. I mean, it's kind of like the Francisco Lindor situation where when he kind of switched up and when he got to New York and said, "I want to be called Francisco now, no more Frankie," and he called it lazy. I mean, he was right calling it lazy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but you got to think, you're 20 years old, you're coming up, you get America the first time, you're gonna feel that pressure just to. But I mean, mind you, Francisco Lindor has also been on record about how much Roberto Clemente has inspired him as Afro Latino, because and Lindor has claimed Afro Latino, has claimed being Afro Latino on record as well. So there's that aspect of it. So you could tell he was kind of following in Clemente's footsteps, and it's interesting because the backlash he got, I mean, expectedly, but he could have went about it a little bit better. He could have went about it a lot better, too. I will say that, but I will say that it's a similar aspect to just respecting black players and their names, and it starts with our names. I mean, like you got to think about um, what are some other examples? I mean, there's the influx of black players, of African players, and coming into baseball right now. You got Akil Badu at the major league level from who's Ghanaian and Trinidadian. You got Tuki Toussaint, who's Haitian and Kenyan. They're just two of the African guys in the majors right now. You got Cannon Smith and Jigba in the minors, and other guys, Jordan Wobu in the Cubs, Cannon Smith and Jigba for the Pirates. So you got to think about if they're gonna butcher their names and some of the guys of names like Henry Aaron and some of the even Latin American player names, how they're gonna do with African players with names that have 4, 5, 6 syllables in them.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely something that's important.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's telling. It's telling.
and it is lazy. It's so easy to get a player's name right. Just learn it, say it right, spell it right, and then just continue to get
And
it
that's
right.
also part of the Anglophone bias in baseball too, with wanting to refusing to sit down and learn the name of a foreign player correctly.
Yeah, it's as someone who does a podcast and has to learn how to pronounce names right, I try and make an effort, and it's an important thing, and it's a really easy thing to do. Is just go figure out, ask somebody who knows, and
And
then you get
people
it
know. I
right.
don't think people really understand how much people notice and pay attention to those type of things from the
Yeah,
outside looking in. And that's how you draw in fans. That's how you people are like where the how do you bring in more black fans to the game? Little intentional stuff like this, respecting people's names and,
and that's something
and
that happened
things
like
like that.
recently with Martin Perez, who we have mispronounced his name for basically the entirety. Just in his second stint now back, it was everyone called him Martin Perez, and there's an accent over that first E that I had not seen, and that everyone just called him Martin Perez. And now that he's back, broadcasters are calling it, and they're kind of the ones who lead the charge. I mean, this is a white player who that everyone called him Nate Lowe, and his mom was like, "Hey, it's Nathaniel." Like it's not the same thing, but like it's a similar just like mindset. Like you call people by their name because that's who they are, and it's important about their identity. But speaking of Rangers current players, the Rangers have quite a few really good black players on their team, and a guy who, and Marcus Semien, who hasn't done super well to start the season, but has been a really great player and signed a huge contract with the Rangers. And he was in Texas during the heat of the George Floyd protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, when it was sweeping across all of sports, and baseball was one of the last and worst sports to get on board with the protest, with sitting out games. The NBA really led the charge there, and Simeon was one of the ones who led the charge in Major League Baseball, and it was in a game when they were playing against the Rangers. And I think part of why that took so long to get across baseball is not only because baseball is old school, but baseball is extremely white these days. And what are some of the factors that have led to the game of baseball becoming like less and less of a black sport and less predominantly black athletes dominating in the sport, and maybe even having access? Is that what part of the problem is?
Yeah, so social access. I mean, the sport got really expensive in the '80s and '90s, and also it moved away from the inner city, things like that. Um, so there's that aspect. It was easier for basketball, and it's a lot cheaper to play basketball and football just because of the amount of money it makes. So there's also the structure of college sports as well with scholarships and things like that. Beginning basketball and football scholarship is way easier than it is to get a baseball scholarship. So, I mean, the system itself is also prejudiced against the black players too. And there's many layers to it. And it starts with the fact that the cost mostly affects working class black families. Um, so, and the fact that there's no local teams in the areas. Lack of black players means at all levels means a lack of black coaches in future years and things like that. So they really just broke the whole pipeline that the black community had set up, and it now had to be reset.
What are some of the things that Major League Baseball is doing? I know they're putting a lot of trying to at least promoting the RBI program, the Return to Baseball in the inner
So
cities.
yeah, they're revamping the RBI program some more after it's been successful with guys like Hunter Green, J.P. Crawford, Dom Smith, being products of it. Um, they're really there's a large uptick in black players reaching the minors and the majors right now. That's kind of not getting so much coverage as it should be, um, especially at positions like catcher, and which is unheard of since retirement of Russell Martin.
Yeah, there
Um,
hasn't been. There was a story that was
there's
was
only
written.
been There's
about
hasn't been a full-time black catcher since retirement of Russell Martin.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. The Rangers drafted a black catcher, Ian Mahler,
Ian
in the
Mahler.
4th round, and he is looking like a really quality prospect and look like he has a pretty long-term career ahead of him, hopefully, if things keep breaking his way. But the fact that, like, there hasn't been a black catcher since Russell Martin is just absolutely insane.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show you how far we have to go still.
We definitely do. And what are some of the things that I don't know, that we in media should be talking more about, should be focusing more about and highlighting, and that have been purposefully swept under the rug and gone and not gotten attention either intentionally or just through forgetfulness?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I really can't tell what other people.
Such a very
really should be
broad
doing,
question,
you know?
badly phrased on my
I
part.
mean, I mean, no, you're good. I mean, it's a slippery slope, you know. I mean, some people just don't have the band what to do to separate things, and that's okay. They should stick to what they're doing, and other people do. I mean, but they may be oblivious and ignorant and may not. There's a reason this stuff is talked about enough because they don't want it to be. I mean, so I mean, and set up that way. So I mean, it's an uphill battle. At the same time, it's also I don't even know what another aspect would be. So yeah, I think I kind of covered all the bases there.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just highlighting black players, black excellence, and other black writers. I mean, I was trying to go through my seeing all the Jackie Robinson Day stuff. I'm like, there are very few black baseball writers and podcasters and people that I follow, and I think part of it is just celebrating those people and bringing their perspective to people who don't normally think like that. Is to influence put people that think differently than you and put black people in your sphere of influence, listen to what they have to say, and promote them when they are saying things. I think that's part of it, and it's part of everybody's duty in media, especially in sports media, where you're literally making your money off of, talking about, black people and, Latin people and Afro Latino people. You all absolutely have to tell their stories because they are making you money. And if you are not doing that, then you're doing a disservice to them, and you should be doing some other job, in my opinion.
I understand.
But Pat, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, where can people find your book that is coming out on Jackie Robinson?
So this book on Jackie Robinson being published by Saber. It's on Amazon.com. I can send you a link so you can put in the description. I'll send you 2 links. There's gonna be one link for a hard copy on Amazon, and Saber has a link for digital copies you could buy. So
sweet. Well, Pat, thank you so much for joining me, guys. Thank you so much for listening to Locked
thank you for having me,
on
Bryce.
Rangers.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is great stuff, Pat. Everybody, go follow Pat at @tangible_Uno. Thank you guys so much for listening, and until next time, don't forget to enjoy baseball.